The rumor spreads in whispers and headlines. A book of the Bible so shocking that some traditions refuse to keep it. A widow who walks into an enemy camp, prays with tears, and walks out with a general's head in her food bag. A battle won by fasting, courage, and a blade. The book of Judith feels like a thunderclap in the quiet of canon lists and church libraries. And over centuries it has been praised, sidelined, translated, questioned, and celebrated in luminous paintings. The word banned follows it around like a shadow. But the shadow has a complicated history. Here is the core story that caused all the turbulence. In 16 chapters preserved in Greek, a tale unfolds of a tyrant who demands absolute submission. A king named Nebuchadnezzar sends his general Holofernes to crush every nation that refuses to bow. The campaign pushes to the edge of Judah. A hill town called Bethulia is besieged. The water supply is cut. The elders promise surrender within 5 days if God does not act. A widow named Judith steps forward. Her husband had died years earlier. She keeps fasts, wears sackcloth, and is known for wisdom. She prepares, but not by rallying troops. She washes perfumes, dresses herself with care, takes her food and wine to remain kosher, and walks straight into the enemy camp with her maid. Her plan is stark and clean. She promises the general inside information. She never breaks the law. She never eats their food. She prays in a whispered lament to the God who once gave Simeon and Levi courage. She waits until Holofernes is drunk. Then, with his own sword, she strikes. 2 blows. The head is wrapped and carried out under the cover of darkness. When she displays it, panic spreads among the invaders. The people charge at dawn. Victory erupts like a storm after drought. The book ends with a hymn. Judith is praised, blessed above all women. She lives to 105, never remarries, and Israel rests. A story concise and ferocious. And then the tension begins. The opening line of Judith does not sound like a court chronicle. It places Nebuchadnezzar in Nineveh as king of Assyria. Real history places that king in Babylon, and Nineveh had fallen in 612 BCE. The book names an Arphaxad as king of the Medes, yet known annals or inscriptions do not match that name. It describes the glorious walls of Ecbatana in terms that align awkwardly with timelines. It introduces Bethulia, a fortified town whose location remains uncertain. None of this reads like a modern textbook, and that difference created friction. Scholars across centuries have noticed the pattern. The names feel symbol-laden, the geography feels deliberately rearranged, the dates refuse to pin down like butterflies in a case. The Greek text of Judith carries Hebraic turns of phrase. Jerome, translating into Latin in Bethlehem around 405 CE, says he worked from a Chaldean or Hebrew text and produced a Latin version rapidly, with a nod to widespread church usage. He records that the book was accounted scripture in councils known to him. He also admits the Jewish communities of his day did not count it in the Hebrew canon. He includes it anyway and places it in the Vulgate. That line "Jews did not include it, Christians did" becomes the hinge of the whole story, and it feeds the rumor of a ban. The real picture looks far messier and far more interesting. The Book of Judith arrives to most of us in Greek. Copies survive in major manuscripts, Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus among them. Some early Latin versions existed before Jerome. His Vulgate edition partly replaced them, though the Old Latin lingered in places with minor differences. The Syriac tradition kept Judith as well, especially through translations linked to the Septuagint stream. The Ethiopian church includes Judith in Giza. In other words, the book traveled widely in the Christian world, living in multiple languages. In Jewish tradition, a different trajectory took shape. During the Second Temple period, many Jews read scriptures in Greek, especially outside Judea, and the Septuagint formed a bridge for diaspora communities. Yet later rabbinic lists crystallized a Hebrew canon that did not include Judith. Whether a formal synod struck it off the roster never finds clear proof. The famous idea of a binding Council of Jamnia, around 90 CE, simplifies what historians now see as a longer, more fluid process. The result lands in plain sight. The Tanakh ended without Judith. The absence created a boundary that would echo for millennia. The absence did not mean the story disappeared among Jews. Medieval traditions around Hanukkah tell of a brave woman named Judith, who fed salty cheese to a Seleucid commander to make him thirsty, then gave him wine until he slept, and killed him. That detail flows in medieval midrash and local tales and influences festival customs of dairy foods. The canonical book of Judith knows nothing of cheese. The medieval Yehuda tradition springs from the same soil of resistance and piety, shaped by centuries of memory and teaching. Written Hebrew versions of Judith circulated in the Middle Ages, distinct in language and style from the Greek, showing that the story kept breathing even outside the canon. In the Christian West, Judith took root both in liturgy and art. Her song appears in the Roman breviary. The Latin antiphon, Tu Gloria Jerusalem, Tu Laetitia Israel, Tu Honorificentia Populi Nostri, echoes her praise and travels into Marian devotion. Artists seized the scene with intensity. Donatello sculpted Judith in Holofernes in bronze around 1460, a warning against tyranny placed in Florence. Caravaggio painted the moment of beheading with shadow and shock around 1598 and 1599. Artemisia Gentileschi painted it with raw force, asserting feminine agency with brush and blade. The story never lay quiet. Its position inside or outside the biblical canon, however, did not remain quiet either. Early Christian writers reflect a spectrum. Clement of Rome, late 1st century, holds up Judith as a model of faith who delivered Israel. Origen knows the book well. Athanasius, in his 39th festal letter of 367, lists the Hebrew books as the canonical Old Testament, and then names Judith, along with Wisdom, Sirach, Tobit, and others, as books appointed to be read by those newly coming to the faith, edifying, but outside the strict canon. Augustine, Bishop of Hippo, reads the list differently. In North Africa, synods at Hippo, 393, and Carthage, 397, reaffirmed 419, include Judith among canonical scriptures used in the Church. The same mixed pattern continues until the Reformation forces definitions into bolder ink. The pressure point lands in the 16th century. Martin Luther translates the Bible into German and gathers a set of writings under a heading that will become famous: Apocrypha. He writes of these as books not equal to Holy Scripture, yet useful and good to read. He includes Judith in this section. The 1534 Luther Bible carries Judith in the Apocrypha. In England, the Church of England takes a middle route. The 39 Articles, 1571, say the Church reads these books for example of life and instruction of manners, but does not use them to establish doctrine. The 1611 King James Version includes Judith and the other Apocrypha between the Testaments, printed as a separate section. An order in 1615 from Archbishop George Abbot instructs English printers not to omit the Apocrypha. The practice is clear. English Bibles include Judith for centuries as edifying reading. In Geneva and among Reformed communities, another current grows stronger. The Westminster Confession of Faith, 1647, states that the books commonly called Apocrypha are not of divine inspiration and are no part of the canon of Scripture, and thus carry no authority in the Church of God. In Puritan England, public reading of the Apocrypha in worship faces suppression. Yet even then, printed Bibles continue to include them for a long time. Judith lives in print, with a label, a boundary, and a persistent readership. Meanwhile, the Roman Catholic Church speaks with unmistakable clarity at the Council of Trent in April 1046. A list of sacred and canonical books includes Judith. The decree states that these books are to be received with equal devotion and reverence. Anyone who does not receive them as sacred and canonical is placed under anathema. The canon lists come down in formal lines. Rome includes Judith. Most Protestants do not. The Church of England allows it for reading without doctrinal authority. Eastern Orthodox churches preserve it in their Old Testament based on the Septuagint, with local variations. Across these streams, the claim of a religious ban looks thinner than the rhetoric. The reality reads as reception, boundary, permission, and exclusion carried by tradition. Then the 19th century adds a new twist that permanently reshapes what millions hold in their hands. The British and Foreign Bible Society, founded in 1804, set out to distribute affordable Bibles around the world. Costs mattered. Ages mattered. Theology mattered. An intense dispute ignites in the 1820s, when the Society funds Bibles on the continent that include the Apocrypha, while many supporters in Scotland and England oppose this policy. Robert Haldane, a prominent Scottish evangelical, leads the charge against BFBS support for Apocrypha. The controversy burns. In 1986, the Society adopts a resolution that no funds will be used for editions with the Apocrypha. That decision ripples outward. The American Bible Society, formed in 1816, follows similar principles. Cheap Protestant Bibles start rolling off presses without those extra pages between Malachi and Matthew. Judith, Tobit, Wisdom, Sirach, the Maccabees gone from mass-market Protestant printings. The effect resembles a ban without the trappings of legal prohibition. Price points, mission strategy, and confessional identity drive. Editorial decisions. Public schools in the United States, already wrestling with sectarian tension, adopt Bibles that omit the Apocrypha. Many families raised in Protestant traditions grow up with no sight of Judith at all. The Queen James of 1611 included it, but later editions drop it. By the late 19th century, a campaign for thinner, cheaper Bibles succeeds. Judith's absence becomes normal in vast swaths of the English-speaking world. In Catholic and Orthodox countries, nothing like a ban occurs. The Vulgate by Jerome places Judith in its familiar orbit. The Council of Trent has drawn the line. The Greek Orthodox Bible prints it as scripture. The Slavic Orthodox traditions receive it. Copts and Ethiopians use it. In those churches, Judith is read as the church reads scripture. In lectionaries, in sermons, in hymnody, the Marian application continues, linking Judith's victory with the Theotokos' victory over the enemy. Icons show Judith with the sword and the head, a fearless woman who breaks a siege with piety. Historicity never leaves the conversation. Skeptics point to Nebuchadnezzar in Nineveh and the unknown Arphaxad as deal-breakers for historical narrative. Defenders point to the literary genre that Hellenistic Jews used with skill. Historical novella, crafted to teach covenant loyalty under oppressive empires. The Book of Esther uses Persian court intrigue with cunning narrative techniques. Daniel tells stories of Babylonian and Persian courts laced with visions. Judith stands in that world of edifying urgent fiction, or at least fiction-like instruction, where history is a stage and faithfulness the plot. None of this bothered early Christians who read it for lessons of courage. The lack of a Hebrew original has long puzzled readers. Jerome said he translated Judith from a Chaldean text, likely Aramaic, in just one day. He notes that he relied on the sense, not word-for-word conversion, because the style of the original did not yield line-by-line equivalence. His claim later readers contested, but the content bears marks of Semitic phrasing beneath the Greek. No copy emerged from the Dead Sea caves. Qumran produced Sirach in Hebrew, Tobit fragments in Aramaic and Hebrew, pieces of the Epistle of Jeremiah, but not a fragment of Judith. Absence is not disproof. The caves reflect a library, not the empire of all books. Yet the silence left the case open for skeptics. The most jarring charge against Judith in post-biblical debate sits right at the front. The opening verse. The text proclaims Nebuchadnezzar, king of the Assyrians, who reigns in Nineveh. A reader trained in Chronicles, 2 Kings, and archaeology would flinch. Yet this jar may be the point. The book places a faceless tyrant in the ancient memory of Assyria and recasts him with Babylon's famous name. He becomes the all-empires-in-one monster who crushes nations and demands worship. Holofernes functions as the arm of this totalitarian king. The result is a composite villain whose name and city draw memories of Assyrian terror and Babylonian arrogance together. Judith's opponents become archetypal. That device makes the story a teaching book rather than a museum label. The language of Judith supports that interpretation. It leans on Scripture. Her prayer recalls the violence of Simeon and Levi in Genesis 34 and pleads for righteous retribution. Her purity standards extend the law into enemy territory with careful discipline. She brings her own food and keeps her hands clean of impurity. The elders set 5 days before surrender, a motif of testing. Israel's victory after the display of the head resembles the sudden rout after Gideon's trumpets and lamps. Judith's hymn mirrors the song of Miriam and Deborah. The book is drenched in biblical echoes. Arguments around Judith become arguments about what the Bible is allowed to be. For Catholics and Orthodox, it remains Scripture because the Church has received it that way, and the presence of historical difficulty does not dislodge it. For Protestants, the absence from the Hebrew canon matters decisively, and the historical anomalies lower confidence. When confessional identities hardens, the book's position hardens. In artistic and devotional use, Judith becomes more, not less, controversial. She is a woman who clothes herself beautifully and walks into the tent of a man prepared to seduce or enslave. The text insists on her chastity, yet her strategy uses beauty as bait. She lies to a general for the sake of a higher truth. She cuts a man's head off with his own sword. In the Renaissance and Baroque, this paradox fascinates. Donatello's and Gentileschi's works vibrate with a warning to tyrants and a claim for women's agency. Caravaggio explodes the moment like a flash of lightning. The story unsettles pieties while the Church keeps chanting her song. Among Jews, Yehudit gains a softer shape in Hanukkah tales, often beheading a general named Holofernes, or a local tyrant, fed on cheese and wine. The story becomes a symbol of resourceful faith under the Seleucid crisis, likely tracing back to the same moral universe as the Greek Judith, while developing as a separate branch in Jewish memory. Rabbis never adopted Judith into the Tanakh. Medieval sages pass along the story as an edifying tale rather than as scripture. It is easy to see how the word band rides in on this complexity. In Protestant America, people stop seeing Judith in their Bibles and assume suppression. In Roman Catholic circles, she never goes away, and in Orthodox churches, she never leaves the throne. In Jewish communities, she never enters the canon, but appears in folklore like a winter star rising over Hanukkah. The one word flattens a landscape of canons, languages, and printers' decisions into a melodramatic noun. Greek manuscripts anchor the text in the Septuagint tradition. Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus carry it. Jerome translates Judith for the Vulgate and testifies that the Hebrews do not use it. He includes it anyway, on the faith of the Church. Clement of Rome and other fathers cite it as model and instruction. Augustine and North African councils embrace it as canonical. Athanasius places it among edifying books. The Council of Trent, in 1546, lists Judith by name as canonical. The King James Version, in 161:11, prints Judith in the Apocrypha. The Westminster Confession, in 1647, rejects the Apocrypha from canon. In 1926, The British and Foreign Bible Society decides not to fund Bibles with the Apocrypha, and Judith disappears from many Protestants' Bibles thereafter. The pattern that emerges is not a police officer's ban, but a corridor of doors marked Enter and Do Not Enter, a series of editorial choices solidified by confessions and budgets. The shock of the story itself did not stop inclusion. Ethical tension did not force removal. Language and canon streams did. Judith herself refuses to behave like a footnote. Her prayer in chapter 9 belongs to the most intense prayers in ancient literature. She humbles herself, confesses the sins of her people, appeals to God's reputation among the nations, and names specific moments of covenant history. Her tactical mind moves without wavering. She refuses to eat in Holofernes' camp and brings her own kosher provisions, even as she dines in his presence. She promises to report intelligence, which she indeed provides in the form of providential truth. Surrender is defeat. Waiting is fatal. The God of Israel will intervene. She carves the victory into time with a song that lingers like Miriam's. The line, "Blessed are you, daughter, by the Most High God above all women on earth," in Judith 13 becomes a submerged gold vein in Christian theology, echoing into the Gospel of Luke's "Blessed are you among women," addressed to Mary. The typology grows. Judith defeats the tyrannical enemy by mortal weakness fortified by grace. Mary crushes the serpent through her yes. Medieval preachers love the resonance. Some modern readers worry that Judith uses deception. They see her approach to the general as dissimulation. Yet the book does not read as a morality tale of lying. It reads as a mosaic of the Bible's own combat ethics under oppressive war. Rahab hides spies in Jericho and misdirects soldiers, and she is praised. Jael drives a tent peg through Sisera's head after giving him milk, and she is blessed. Judith stands in that line of resistance literature under empire. The text itself insists on her purity and devotion, and uses her as a banner for holiness under fire. The scramble to pin down a historical setting brings mixed proposals. Some suggest the names point to the time of the Assyrians and Babylonians, but the crisis feels like the Maccabean struggle of the 2nd century BCE, the age of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Others propose that Arphaxad is a cipher for Phraortes of Media, Holofernes a Hellenistic name placed in an earlier scene, Nebuchadnezzar a deliberate conflation. None of these theories close the file. Most modern scholars date the composition between the late 2nd and early 1st century BCE, based on language and political texture, not because Nebuchadnezzar could have reigned in Nineveh. In other words, the book likely teaches with a story crafted for a time of looming oppression. Historical anachronism becomes the fabric of a parable of covenant. Judith's textual history has quirks of its own. The Latin version by Jerome is shorter in places than the longer Greek text. Old Latin witnesses sometimes preserve readings closer to the Greek. Greek manuscripts themselves vary slightly, as ancient texts always do. The Peshitta and Syro-Hexaplar, Old Syriac versions, showing the book's range. The story retains its power regardless of the textual family. A besieged community saved by the bravery of a widow whose strategy honors the law and trusts the God of Israel. The Book of Judith proves useful to sermons in turbulent ages. Reformers and counter-reformers alike use her image. Civic leaders see in Judith the city itself rising against a tyrant. In Florence, Donatello's statue stood as a political statement against the Medici's oppressive tendencies. In the Catholic Reformed era, Judith becomes a symbol of the Church's triumph over error. In Protestant imagination, she becomes a symbol of the faithful community triumphing over a corrupt ecclesial empire. Irony drips from the edges of the canvas. The same sword swings in different hands. The data points that the internet loves to compress into a shocking pitch banned by Jews, banned by Protestants, rescued by Rome Snap when tested. Jews did not ban it. They did not canonize it. Ancient Jews used and retold the story in midrash and folklore. Protestants did not ban it. They did not put it into their canon. They often included it as instructive reading, until the cost-benefit calculations of Bible societies removed it from public prints. Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox did not smuggle it into the Bible. They inherited it from ancient usage of the Greek scriptures, affirmed by councils or tradition, and read it in churches across centuries. The fascination remains. A book that tangles empire, gender, sanctity, and violence always draws intense attention. Judith is a heroine with a sword, who prays like a prophet and sings like Miriam. She refuses to become tame. The edges that caused historical resistance still gleam. The city called Bethulia has no secure archaeological match. Some propose that the name hides symbolism. Bethulia in Hebrew means maiden or virgin, and the besieged city becomes a virgin rescued by a chaste widow. The pun would fit the book's fondness for layered meaning. The reference to Ecbatana's defensive walls matches ancient descriptions imperfectly. The numbers in Holofernes' army strain credulity if read with a modern calculator, rather than as a rhetorical marker of overwhelming odds. The narrative exposes the cult of power and then breaks it with piety. One more layer explains the longevity of the word band attached to Judith. The 19th century decisions of Bible societies coincided with the rise of universal public education in English-speaking nations. Schoolroom Bibles became religiously neutral in a Protestant sense, stripped of apocrypha. Generations grew up never seeing Judith in class or pew. When 20th century Catholics reasserted their canon at the Second Vatican Council long after Trent, they did not add Judith. They held it as always held. Evangelicals in the late 20th century rediscovered the Apocrypha for historical and literary context, yet retained confessional boundaries. That cultural separation created two parallel memory palaces. One side displayed Judith in gold and red. The other had an empty niche. The silence around Judith in the King James Bible, as commonly sold after 1,826 changes, how modern readers hear claims. When a preacher says that Judith was banned, ears trained by absence nod. When a Catholic or Orthodox reader hears the same word, it sounds off-key. Reality sits between, not banned, but filtered, not suppressed by a state, but streamlined by societies that standardized Bibles for mass distribution. Those societies sincerely believed they served the purity of Scripture. They also cut printing costs and simplified logistics. The story evaporated from what felt like the Bible to millions. Inside traditions that kept Judith, the book stayed entangled in devotional life. Its passages appear in the Roman Rite, such as in readings and chants that celebrate Mary. The Eastern Church sings about the triumphant woman who delivered the people by faith. The story encourages believers to face empire with fasting and courage. The cross against the sword. The early church saw in Judith a portrait of the church itself defeating the devil's siege. The Song of Judith 16 becomes a war hymn sung softly in monasteries. Judith's ethical sting did not spare her from defenders. Thomas Aquinas discusses lying, but not primarily through Judith. Later theologians touch her case in treatises about mixed goods in wartime. The text appears content with her ruse and more concerned with her holiness. Not every text in Scripture functions as a simple ethical manual anyway. It offers doctrine, reproof, correction, and training in righteousness through narrative, poetry, and apocalyptic. Judith's teaching comes wrapped in a headscarf and carried in a cloth bundle. The moral shock of decapitation plays a role in art and controversy. Artemisia Gentileschi, painting in the wake of personal trauma, pours brutal truth into her Judith beheading Holofernes around 1612 to 1613. The angle of the blade, the muscularity, the shared concentration between Judith and her maid, break the polite distance of academic painting. Theologians and pastors use those images to confront evil and to warn abusers. The story becomes a mirror, sometimes too clear, always sharp. In the end, the path of Judith through history teaches more about readers than about the book. Readers fearful of confusion insist on clear canon lines. They place Judith in a safe alcove called Apocrypha, then roll the printing presses without that alcove for the sake of clarity. Readers confident in the Church's reception keep Judith in the heart of the Bible, defending the inclusion against charges of novelty or error. Jewish tradition keeps the story at the margin, allowing memory to reshape it for Hanukkah, without reassigning it to the synagogue scrolls. The question of origins continues to draw careful scholarship. Some see Persian-era shadows, most see Hellenistic-era challenges. Literary form and theology signal a work that addresses Jews under foreign threat with a tale of pious daring. The protagonist's name, Yehudit, means simply Judean or Jewish woman. The universality of her name underscores her role. Every faithful woman, every faithful city, every faithful people. The book trades in archetypes for the sake of moral clarity. Nebuchadnezzar, Holofernes, Arphaxad, Bethulia names with edges but few anchors, pushed into service for the plot's moral geometry. Ethically, Judith stitches together impossible virtues into a single life. Chastity, courage, fasting, strategy, and martial resolve. She refuses to collapse into stereotypes. She prays like a penitent and kills like Jael. She refuses personal reward and goes home alone. The text marks that final line, intentionally. No private consolation, only public praise and lasting peace for the people. Among Protestants, renewed interest in the Apocrypha has risen in academic and devotional contexts. Study Bibles now include intertestamental literature in appendices. Publishers issue editions of the King James Version with the Apocrypha restored, precisely as in 1611. The argument about canon remains, but the taboo weakens. In Jewish scholarship, Judith receives attention as a late Second Temple text that reflects diaspora virtue and inner resistance to assimilation. In Catholic and Orthodox circles, she stays where she has always been, a heroine who belongs to the Church's lexicon of sanctity. And that word banned slowly dissolves when held up to the light. Judith was not banned by a single authority in a universal way. She was not suppressed as a scandalous story among the faithful. She was sidelined in some canons, kept in others, and removed from mass-market editions by 19th-century policy and economy. She never stopped speaking across the centuries. The rumor of her exile turns out to be a case of passports and borders, not prison. The prize of tracing her path arrives on the last page of the book, Judith's Song. It rejoices in God's breaking of the mighty. It lifts up the humble. It blesses the one who defended her people. It sounds like the Magnificat before the Magnificat. It turns the severed head into a symbol of what God does to those who rage against his covenant. It refuses despair and leaves the people at rest. This is the untold history behind the shock and the whisper. When a Bible lacks Judith, it tells a story about confessions and publishing decisions. When a Bible includes Judith, it tells a story about reception and tradition. When a Hanukkah table includes cheese, it tells a story about memory and the creativity of the people. When a museum wall holds Judith and Holofernes, it tells a story about how faith and violence collide in the human heart. The Book of Judith survived every attempt to minimize it by becoming harder to ignore. Its heroine's name means the Jewish woman, but her courage belongs to anyone who takes up fasting and truth against a siege. Her strategy teaches that holiness is not passivity. Her prayer teaches that lament can sharpen a blade. The canon lines mark out the maps of traditions. The story itself keeps marching past borders, holding a sword in one hand and a hymn in the other. The path forward involves precision and courage. Precision tells the truth about canons, councils, print shops, and policies. Courage lets the story speak across those facts. The repeated claim that Judith was banned wilts under precise history. The truth turns out more intriguing than the rumor. Judith's position fills in the blank spaces on a map of Bible history that runs through Greek translation rooms, Latin monasteries, rabbinic academies, Florentine workshops, Reformation debates, and London boardrooms. She stood through all of it. When Nebuchadnezzar becomes king of the Assyrians in Nineveh, at the beginning of the book, the contradiction announces something deliberate. This tyrant represents all the empires that tried to swallow Israel whole. Judith, the widow from Bethulia, becomes the counter-empire. She speaks softly and carries a prayer. She returns with the head that terrorized her city. The text wants readers to remember that obedience to God breaks the siege of the proud. Jerome's one-day translation from a Chaldean text announces something else. The Church saw the book as useful and authoritative enough to place into Latin even against a narrowing Hebrew canon. Luther's placement of Judith into the Apocrypha announces his desire to distinguish edifying reading from canonical doctrine. The Council of Trent announces the Church's resolve to keep the whole Septuagint stream in her canon. The Westminster Confession prints the dividing line across Protestant identity. The British and Foreign Bible Society announces a policy that shapes what ordinary people read in their homes for 200 years. Each announcement refracts Judith's story into cultural memory. Against that prism, the book remains intensely simple. A woman prays, fasts, and acts. A people are spared. A song is sung. The canon sits above like a sky of stars, arranging constellations that each community follows. Judith's star either glows among them or hovers at the edge as a comet that returns with regularity to light up the night. The rumor of a ban disappears under the starlight. The historical anomalies, once seen as embarrassment, turn into key signatures. They allow Judith to travel. She becomes relevant wherever empire oppresses and piety hangs by a thread. If the tale had been nailed to one date and one place, it might have become a museum plaque. As it stands, it reads like Esther and Daniel, history like tales that carry theology under the skin. In modern editions, readers have choices again. Catholic, Orthodox, and some ecumenical Bibles present Judith as scripture. Purely Protestant Bibles, following their confession, do not. Some publishers restore the Apocrypha for historical literacy. Digital libraries bring Judith back to those who never saw it in print. The boundaries remain, but the bridges are multiplying. Judith's beheading of Holofernes creates discomfort even today. It provokes debates about violence and sanctity, about deception and warfare ethics, about gender and power. The Book of Judith provides no tidy footnotes to solve those debates. It provides a story that refuses to flinch. It makes enemies of idolatry and tyranny, and shows a widow defeating both. The discomfort forces readers to reckon with the rawness of the Bible's world, a world where covenant and empire cross swords. The richest turn arrives in the song. Judith sings, and her voice lays down the interpretation. Power belongs to the Lord who humbles the haughty. The victory belongs to God, not to charm or trickery. Judith returns home and does not monetize the moment or seize office. She fasts as before. Her life returns to its rhythm of prayer. The victory's permanence shows up not in Judith's status, but in the rest of the people. The untold history of why Judith was labeled banned turns out to be the history of how the Bible itself came to many of us. Ingenious translations passed the text from Greek into Latin, Syriac, and other languages. Debates over canons hardened into confessions. Print revolutions multiplied copies and standardized habits. 19th-century mission societies made pragmatic decisions that reshaped devotional experience in English-speaking nations. Modern ecumenical efforts restore ancient texts to sight without tearing down confessional walls. Through it all, a widow from Bethulia keeps walking across the campfires of enemy armies and across the pages of catechisms and commentaries. Judith was not banned. Was judged, defended, printed, omitted, celebrated, forgotten, painted, sung, and recovered. The controversy that surrounds her becomes an invitation to read carefully and to honor the differences between traditions without flattening them. The story remains: a besieged people, a courageous widow, a sword in the dark, a song at dawn. The lines of canon might alter shelf order. They do not alter the thunder in those scenes. Judith's legacy cannot be contained by a single word. She belongs to the church fathers who praised her faith. She belongs to the councils that listed her book. She belongs to the reformers who respected but sidelined her. She belongs to Jewish mothers telling stories at Hanukkah with plates of cheese on the table. She belongs to museums that bear witness to how artists wrestled with holiness and terror. She belongs to modern readers who pick up a Bible that includes her or does not, and then go hunting until they find what was missing. In a canon war, Judith became a symbol. In a prayer war, she became a patron. In an art war, she became a muse. The most accurate sentence about her status slips past the extremes. She was not banned. She was contested. The contest produced maps of the Christian and Jewish worlds. The outcome still shapes how people experience Scripture. Walk back to that tent. The camp is sleeping. A woman enters and prays. The general drinks and collapses. The sword comes down. The head falls. A city is saved. The song begins. The canon debates flare centuries later. Printers draw up budgets. Committees vote. But in the Bible that includes her, Judith still sings. And in the Bible that does not, her name still echoes in the nooks and crannies of sermons and midrash. Her courage refuses exile. Her story survives the rumor that tried to flatten it into a scandal. The better headline reads, "Like a confession of complexity." Excluded from the Jewish canon, placed in Christian canons through the Septuagint, printed in Protestant Bibles until the early 1800s, then widely dropped because of theological policy and printing cost, embraced in Catholic and Orthodox canons and liturgies, alive in Jewish folklore. Unending in art, the untold history replaces rumor with a network of decisions and a chorus of traditions. That replacement offers more than facts. It invites a return to the story itself. The woman who fasts, the leader who prays, the city that waits, the blade that ends the siege, the hymn that lifts the people into rest. The Book of Judith stands at the crossroads of history and hope, not because of scandal, but because of fidelity. Readers who seek scandal find rumors. Readers who seek fidelity find Judith.